This is illegal!
I'm a federal game warden, ma'am. You're out of line.
The HOA tyrant who tried to find me for hunting on my land, turns out I'm the federal game warden. It was a crisp October morning in 2025 when I realized my peaceful life in suburban Virginia was about to be turned upside down. I'd just settled onto my back porch with a steaming mug of coffee, watching a family of deer graze in my yard, when I heard the unmistakable screech of a neighbor who thought she ruled the world. That was the day Margaret Wilson, the HOA president from hell, decided to call the cops on me for hunting on my own property and tried to slap me with a $2,000 fine. What she didn't know was that she'd picked a fight with the wrong man. My name's James Carter, and I'm a federal game warden with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. By the time this was over, Margaret would learn a lesson she'd never forget. Buckle up, because this story is a wild ride, and justice has never tasted so sweet. I'm 52 years old, and I've lived in this quiet cul-de-sac in Chesterfield County for 5 years. My 5-acre property backs up to a federal wildlife preserve, a slice of heaven where oak trees provide natural cover and the air smells like freedom. I bought this place for one reason: privacy. After decades of dealing with poachers, bureaucrats, and city noise, I wanted a sanctuary where I could hunt, sip coffee, and watch the sunrise without anyone breathing down my neck. For the most part, I'd found it until Margaret Wilson moved in next door. That Tuesday started like a dream. The deer were out, the sky was clear, and hunting season had just kicked off. I'm not some reckless trigger-happy guy. Hunting is my passion, but it's also my job. As a federal game warden, I monitor the preserve that borders my land, ensuring wildlife is protected and regulations are followed. I'd spent weeks preparing, checking my rifle, aligning the scope, and reinforcing a dirt berm I'd built as a backstop for safety. Beyond that berm, there's nothing but trees for half a mile. Everything was by the book: permits, safety measures, the works. I was about an hour into tracking a deer in the preserve when I spotted one near a clearing. I took the shot, clean and precise, and started field dressing the animal. That's when I heard her. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp, like a knife cutting through the forest silence. I turned to see a woman crashing through the underbrush, her face redder than a Virginia sunset. Margaret Wilson, my neighbor, looked like she was about to combust. Her blonde hair was caught in branches, and her eyes burned with the kind of fury you only see in someone convinced they're the ultimate authority. I stayed calm. "Morning, ma'am," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm James Carter, your neighbor. I'm hunting in the federal preserve with proper permits. Everything's legal." I figured she was startled by the gunshot. Maybe we could clear the air, have a neighborly chat, and move on. But the look on her face told me this wasn't going to end with a handshake. "Legal?" she screamed, her voice hitting a pitch that could shatter glass. "You're endangering this entire community. This is a civilized neighborhood, not some redneck hunting camp." She was shaking, pointing at me like I'd just threatened her family. I'll admit, I was taken aback. Gunshots can be jarring, sure, but her reaction was unhinged. "I'm calling the police and the HOA," she spat, already pulling out her phone with the speed of someone who'd done this 100 times. "We'll see how legal this is when they haul you away." She stormed off, dialing as she went, and I stood there, half amused, half concerned. Was I overreacting, or was this woman completely out of her mind? Something told me this was just the beginning. Sure enough, within 30 minutes, a police cruiser rolled into my driveway. Officer Daniel Thompson stepped out, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I showed him my hunting license, federal permits, and the berm I'd built. We walked the property as I explained the preserve's boundaries. Thompson nodded, jotting notes. "Everything checks out, Mr. Carter," he said. "Your setup meets all safety requirements. Might want to give your neighbors a heads up next time, just to keep the peace." Fair enough, I thought. Maybe I should have been more neighborly. Thompson drove off, and I felt good about how things had been handled. But as I watched his car disappear, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Margaret's reaction wasn't just about the gunshot. It was personal, like she had a vendetta against me for existing. I glanced at her house across the street. "Interesting," I muttered. "Let's see how far you take this, Margaret." A week passed without incident, and I started to think Margaret had found someone else to torment. Then I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope from the HOA. I figured it was some routine notice about lawn mowing or community dues. Boy, was I wrong. The letter was a violation notice, printed in bold red letters, demanding $2,000 for violating community safety regulations and noise ordinances. $2,000 for 3 shots on my own land. I laughed out loud, thinking it was a prank. But there, at the bottom, was Margaret Wilson's signature, listed as HOA president. The notice claimed I'd been illegally hunting on community-adjacent land and causing excessive noise disturbances. It included photos of me entering the preserve, time-stamped over the past 2 months, and demanded payment within 7 days or I'd face serious legal consequences. I read it twice, my amusement turning to suspicion. The language was off, the regulations didn't sound real, and the photos suggested Margaret had been watching me for weeks. This wasn't just overreach, it felt like a setup. Instead of getting mad, I got curious. I called the HOA office and spoke to a nervous woman named Sarah Miller. "Hi, Sarah," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "This is James Carter. I got a fine notice that seems questionable. Can you tell me which regulation I violated?" There was a long pause, like she was afraid to speak. "I just handle paperwork, Mr. Carter," she stammered. "Mrs. Wilson makes all enforcement decisions. She said you have 7 days to pay or face consequences." I pressed her for details, but she hung up after promising to call back. That evening, I dove into research mode. I pulled up Virginia HOA laws, community bylaws, and legal precedents. What I found was damning. HOAs can't impose fines like this without a formal process, a warning, a hearing, and a chance to correct the issue. They can't just demand $2,000 and threaten consequences. Margaret was operating outside the law, and those photos proved she'd been stalking me. I created a digital folder labeled Margaret Wilson Documentation and started scanning every piece of evidence. If she wanted to play legal games, I'd play by the real rules. Over the next few days, I became a one-man detective agency. I requested every HOA document I could, meeting minutes, financial reports, violation records, you name it. Sarah sounded terrified each time I called, but she couldn't refuse my requests. When the documents arrived, I hit the jackpot. The financial reports were a mess, thousands of dollars spent on community improvements that all traced back to Margaret's property. $3,000 for landscaping at her address. $2,000 for fence repairs at her house. $1,500 for road maintenance that only benefited her driveway. She was using HOA funds like her personal piggy bank. It got worse. I dug into Margaret's background and found court records from 3 previous neighborhoods. She'd been sued for harassment in all 3, lost every case, and had a restraining order issued against her in the last one. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. Margaret was a serial bully who moved from place to place, terrorizing residents until they fought back or fled. Most people probably paid her fines to avoid the hassle. But I'm not most people. Then my phone rang. It was Sarah, calling from her personal number. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stay silent anymore. Mrs. Wilson's been forcing me to forge meeting minutes, fake board signatures, and issue violation notices for people who haven't done anything wrong. I have proof, and I can't be part of this anymore." My pulse raced. This was the break I needed. "Can we meet somewhere private?" she asked. "She has a file on you, James, photos of your truck, your hunting schedule, everything. She's been planning this for months." We met at a Starbucks 20 miles away, a place where no one would recognize us. Sarah looked exhausted, her hands shaking as she handed me a flash drive. "This has everything," she said. Forged minutes, fake signatures, emails of her threatening residents, and photos of you, organized by date. I thanked her, knowing she was risking everything by coming forward. That night, I pored over the files. It was worse than I'd imagined. Margaret wasn't just bullying, she was running a criminal operation disguised as HOA management, embezzling money, forging documents, and harassing anyone who dared to live their life. As I sat at my desk, surrounded by evidence, a knock at the door startled me. I knew who it was before I opened it. Margaret stood there, her face twisted with smug confidence, holding a court summons. "You're done, James," she said. "Pay the fine, or I'll make sure you lose everything." She turned and walked away, but I just smiled. She had no idea what was coming. I ignored the fine, which drove Margaret insane. She'd spent months building her case, and my silence was like pouring gasoline on her rage. That's when things got creepy. She started driving by my house a dozen times a day, slowing down to stare, sometimes stopping to watch me from her car. One day, I caught her standing at my property line with a telephoto lens, snapping photos while I washed my truck. The clicking became background noise, like cicadas in summer. Then, after a rainy night, I found high-heeled footprints in my backyard, leading from my garden to my garage. Margaret had trespassed, scoping out my hunting gear and peering into my windows. I couldn't stay passive anymore. I installed professional-grade 4K cameras around my property, hidden but covering every angle. I also set up a bait zone near the fence, placing my hunting equipment where Margaret would see it if she snooped again. If she wanted evidence, I'd give her a reason to cross the line and catch her in the act. Sarah called again, her voice urgent. James, Margaret's planning something big. She's talking about a $10,000 lawsuit for emotional damages, saying she'll end your illegal hunting operation. She keeps saying she'll eliminate you permanently. I'm scared she's going to do something dangerous. I thanked her and hung up, her words echoing in my head. Eliminate permanently? What was Margaret capable of? That's when I pulled out my federal badge and ID, staring at it with a grim smile. Margaret, I said to myself, you're about to learn what permanently really means. The next morning, at 5 a.m., I was watching from my kitchen window when Margaret's car crept into my driveway. She was dressed in black, carrying bolt cutters, a hammer, and a massive wooden sign. She moved like a cartoon villain, sneaking toward my backyard. I almost laughed, but the audacity was chilling. She was committed to her plan, whatever it was. My cameras caught everything. Margaret cut through 20 feet of my fence, each snap of the bolt cutters deliberate and methodical. Then she hammered her sign into my lawn. No hunting zone. Violators will be prosecuted by HOA. She was claiming my property as HOA territory illegal and insane. But the kicker? She pulled out her phone and called 911. Emergency, she said, her voice dripping with fake panic. James Carter is violating the HOA hunting ban. I need police now. I watched her stand on my destroyed property, demanding my arrest for rules she'd invented. 15 minutes later, Officer Thompson arrived, looking like he was one call away from retirement. I was on my porch, reading a book and sipping coffee, the picture of calm. Margaret was in my backyard, waving her arms and pointing at her sign like it was proof of my crimes. Mrs. Wilson, Thompson said, his patience gone. What's the emergency? She screamed about the hunting ban, but Thompson just stared at her, then at me, then at the sign. He's reading a book, ma'am. What violation are we talking about? I stood up, calm but firm. Officer, this is different today. I have evidence of who the real criminal is. Margaret's face went pale. I invited Thompson inside and played the security footage. It showed Margaret cutting my fence, hammering her sign, and calling 911, all time-stamped. Thompson's jaw tightened as he watched. We stepped outside, and I played the video for Margaret. Her eyes widened, her confidence crumbling. That's fabricated, she shrieked, but her voice cracked. He manipulated it. Thompson wasn't buying it. Ma'am, this is time-stamped footage from multiple angles. It shows you vandalizing Mr. Carter's property. But I wasn't done. I pulled Thompson aside and showed him my federal badge. I'm James Carter, Federal Wildlife Officer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I said. My hunting activities are part of my official duties on the preserve. Mrs. Wilson hasn't just harassed a neighbor, obstructed a federal officer, vandalized property adjacent to federal land, and filed false police reports. These are federal crimes. Thompson's demeanor shifted to full respect. Yes, sir, Officer Carter. I had no idea. Outside, Margaret was eavesdropping, her face ashen when she heard federal officer. She stumbled backward, crashing into a patio chair. My attorney, Robert Hayes, arrived with a briefcase of documents. Mrs. Wilson has embezzled $7,000 from the HOA, forged documents, and harassed residents for years, he said, laying out the evidence. Margaret's world collapsed. This can't be happening, she stammered. I'm the HOA president. You're not in charge anymore, I said coldly. You've broken the law, and now you'll pay. Thompson arrested her for vandalism, harassment, false reports, and obstructing a federal officer. The handcuffs clicking around her wrists were music to my ears. The fallout was swift. Within 24 hours, an emergency HOA meeting removed Margaret as president. Sarah became interim president, reversing Margaret's illegal policies. Federal charges were filed, and the HOA demanded repayment of the $7,000 she'd stolen. I sued for $15,000 in damages, and a 5-year restraining order was issued. The FBI opened an investigation into her embezzlement and forgery. Former victims came forward, exposing years of abuse. Margaret's reign of terror was over. The neighborhood transformed. Kids played in yards, families displayed decorations, and elderly residents tended their gardens without fear. Sarah texted me, "Thank you for freeing us. We're having a community barbecue, the guest of honor." A week later, I was back on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the deer. My mailbox, once filled with threats, now held thank you notes. The fence was rebuilt, stronger than before, and the HOA was transparent under Sarah's leadership. Margaret sat in federal detention, facing felony charges. Justice was slow, but when it came, it was perfect. I raised my coffee mug in a mock toast to federal justice and bullies learning their place. What do you think? Have you ever faced a tyrant like Margaret? Share your stories in the comments, especially about bullies or injustice in your life. Do you think Margaret deserved her fate, or was the punishment too harsh? Let's hear your stance and hold back.